You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joining you just a day late with Billy Galanko. How you doing, Billy?
Yeah, very well. Good things take time. So this episode had a little while extra to bake.
That's right. We had to sit on the script for a little bit and make sure the lighting was right. So, yeah. We'll be back on track next week. We'll have an episode for you on Wednesday. I know, we got dozens and dozens of emails, people wondering, where's the episode? But don't worry, we're here. We have another Scotch episode today, which I think we've only had one where we talked about Scotch for any length of time. Is that right? Just thinking back when, it might have been earlier this year. So,
yeah. I think we've only had really one. So yeah, it's nice to kind of expand our breadth. We focused a lot on American and some other styles of whiskey, Canadian as well. So it's cool to kind of pivot back a little bit.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and we speaking of Scotch, we have a bachelor party this weekend for my one buddy. He's getting married later this month, and went and picked up some Oban or Oban. I've heard it both ways. I've been saying Oban. Every bottle shop owner says Oban. I heard it Oban online. I don't know. So, but picked up a bottle of their Distillers Edition 2021, which is a Fino Sherry finished. Single malt, I believe. And interested to try that. Picked up some cigars too. Don't ask me what brand they are, because I was looking for Alec Bradley. The shop didn't carry Alec Bradley, and so I picked up something else that was Nicaraguan tobacco as well, which I tend to like, and said it was a little bit lighter bodied, so maybe should go well with the Oban, which I'm sure isn't super peated.
Nice. Yeah. No. Oban. It's one of those Western Highlands, one of the very few Western Highlands distilleries. So that's interesting. I always like Oban as a thing. In terms of how to say it, I don't know. I'm pretty sure Tom could have told us. It was. I don't think we actually mentioned it on the podcast, but there's he basically described it as a lifetime achievement award, or kind of a recognition. The Keeper of the Quake. I had always pronounced that Keeper of the Quaish. It's like Quiach. So, the Scottish pronunciation of things is even harder for me than like French things.
So, I say that's your French side coming out.
Yeah. Seriously, it's who knows. But speaking of the French side, we'll quickly do, because this is going to be a little bit of a shorter intro for everyone, because we're a day late. We want to get right to the interview. Speaking of the French, what we're drinking this weekend is going to be Margaux, and it's not necessarily going to be. It doesn't have to be the Chateau Margaux. It's the whole AOC, but it was inspired by the Chateau Margaux. But I think it's interesting. I think people kind of lump Bordeaux is kind of a single monolith in their minds. This is just kind of a reminder that not only is it left and right bank, but each of the left bank AOCs, and especially the ones with first grows, have their own kind of personality. So just thinking about Margaux as kind of a more perfumed floral, some people say delicate but still well structured Cabernet based wine, I think it's something to consider. I think Palmer, Chateau Palmer, has been leading kind of the route and sustainability and kind of biodynamics work as well. I don't know if they're full biodynamic, but I know they were testing some efforts, and their star is very much on the rise. So I think Margaux is something that the Margaux lovers really highlight, but I don't know if it always gets all the shine it needs. So I wanted to put a little bit of shine on that. Also, in my never-ending quest to finish this history of wine book, I had a fun fact from, I think it was the middle 1700s. From Margaux, and that's kind of what inspired this, is that and it's The Story of Wine by Hugh Johnson is the book I'm referencing over and over. But the mid 1700s, they the proprietor at the time, they had 3 casks of white wine blended with every batch of red wine made at Chateau Margaux, and
Oh wow.
the ratio was 3 casks to, and they had an old term, but basically it rounded out to be, I'm trying to remember the exact number, I think it was about 28 casks of red wine, and they were just blended in. So I thought that was really interesting. And then at the time, they also made 4 wines. Right now, people may know that they make the Grand Vin, and they also make Margot Papillon, which means butterfly, but that's like their second wine. Back then, they made 4. They made the Grand Vin. They made a second wine. They made a third wine, which they called like the workers' wine, which I assume is kind of like a piquette, actually, because that tended to be what they used for workers. And then they made a proprietor's wine. Basically, the owner of the chateau got his own wine, and he would basically just pick like grapes from the best plots. But apparently, at that time, he, and this is I think early to mid 1700s, preferred like a rosé style. So he basically had them take like the best grapes and make like a kind of light pink style. And I don't know if that's where the blending the white wine came in at the time, but I was like, well, that's cool. So Margot's been on the mind.
Can you hear me?
No.
No. Okay.
Now I can. Now I can.
Okay. We'll pause through here. What was the last thing that you said? Because you cut out like a ton, and like we're completely still.
So are you. Last thing I said was that the proprietor liked his rosé.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been inspired by the white wines. And
Yeah,
then
I heard
I
that
said,
part,
okay. So then I basically just ended with, and that's why, I thought that was interesting. And that's why Margot has kind of been on my mind this week.
Okay. Long pause here, and then we'll go. Yeah, that reminds me of like, I don't know, if a guy starts kind of uh, a business of passion, and they make a really high quality product, and he's like, yeah, but I don't drink it that way. I like to mix it with, it's like you have a whiskey producer who makes a really fancy whiskey, and then they're like, yeah, but I drink it with Coke, or I drink my wine with a ton of ice cubes, and it's like, yeah, I make a rosé out of the best grapes. It makes you think of
Yeah.
someone that would do
Yeah.
that.
I mean, at that time, we're talking. What's interesting is the book is juxtaposing the Bordeaux chapter next to the Burgundy one, and they're basically like
Mm.
with the way that the Dutch kind of drain things, and also the way that kind of grape growing expanded in Bordeaux. People were like discovering the best plots, like starting to grow the best plots in like the 16 and 1700s. So some of these guys, like they talked about, one guy owned like Latour and Lafitte, and he also owned Mouton, which wasn't a first growth at the time. So like there are just like single people just like, oh man, I got a hold of the good stuff, or like right next door, it's like that one's getting a lot of money. I'll plant some grapes here. And they basically discovered what is now, well known, as opposed to like Burgundy, where the, priests or the monks had been basically farming and narrowing down for like 500 years. In Bordeaux, they're just like, this is good stuff. Let's keep making it.
Yeah,
Now I own all of it.
yeah. That's crazy
So,
how like concentrated the property like that we know today was. If you go back several hundred years, how concentrated the ownership was.
or if you go back even further, just there wasn't anything there. And then they're like, you know what? We should plant some grapes here. It's like, turns out
Yeah.
these are much better than right over there. Let's sell them for a lot more. And then they made brands. It was all kind of just created. It's so interesting to me.
Yeah, it's like what wasn't the first like consumer product or consumable advertising created by um a champagne house, I believe.
Potentially. I mean,
It was like the first like
uh,
consumer print ads, maybe.
and according to this book too, I think the first wine ever to be mentioned by like brand name or like vineyard name in England was a Bordeaux. It was one of the first grows, I think. Um, but like they really just started actually marketing their individual lands too. It wasn't just like a generic thing by a certain producer. So a lot of this has been driven.
Yeah, it was Runart when we were there. They were talking about how, yeah, I forget if it was like the first. kind of like advertise paper, like print poster advertisement ever, or if it was flat out the first time that a like consumable, like consumer product was advertised like in en masse like that.
Well, maybe we'll couch it at least for alcohol. I find it hard to believe it
At
was the
least for
first
alcohol. Yeah, it's like no
for
one's ever held up a sign
anything.
being like grapes here or like corn. I don't know. But I mean, like in wide distribution, maybe it was also one of the caveats of like you could see this poster in like the U.S. or I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyways,
yeah, like a campaign, like an
sure,
organized
yeah,
advertising.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
But
sense.
do you want to introduce Tom for our listeners?
Yeah, yeah. So today we have Tom Smith from the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Tom, I actually met him. Oh, yeah. Let me give you guys the actual title before I forget here. Tom's title is Senior Director of the USA, both for sales and I want to make sure I don't mess this up. Sales and Operations Director for the USA. And as part of that, he goes to a bunch of events and kind of meets people, shakes hands, kind of bonds and interacts with the community that is in the U.S. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society has over 8,000 members in the U.S. It's a global Scotch club, basically, where they have independently bottled. They're also an independent bottler. So basically, it's a group of people, an organization that independently bottles whiskeys, and then you have access to it by joining the club. And then Tom was at an event that I went to that was put on by the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. It was actually, you guys have heard me talk about it. It was a tasting with Dave Broom, one of the kind of foremost experts in Scotch, is also one of the most well-known authors. But it was cool to kind of be there. And then this Tom was obviously kind of the co-host, and he was very, very friendly, and we got to talking. And I thought it would be really interesting for everyone to hear a little bit more about Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Obviously, I just kind of gave a little overview that was probably really confusing, so he explains it much better. And then he also gives us a little background into like the world of single malts, what kind of makes them special, how they develop, how they age, and to kind of give a little bit of a sense of how they develop each of their bottlings that they offer for their members.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, I actually didn't know about this Scotch Malt Whisky Society. They have really accessible membership dues, yearly membership rates, and the bottlings are super cool. And they take great care in selecting the bottles that they put together for their members to purchase. And so, yeah, definitely take a look. Tom is a wealth of knowledge and has been in to a lot of cool places, tasted a lot of really cool whiskey, and there's a lot of folks who have forgotten more than many of us will ever know about whiskey. So he's definitely been soaking it up his time in the whiskey and in the wine world too, which he talks about. So hope y'all enjoy. Without further ado, here's Tom.
Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it was serendipitous that I had actually been a Dave Broom fan for a while, and then when I went to that tasting and I got to meet you, it was really kind of an interesting opportunity to get exposed to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society and kind of meet somebody that was potentially a great podcast guest. So we're so excited to have you on the pod today.
Well, I really appreciate that. It was a pleasure to meet you as well, and thanks to you and Brady for having me. It's always a real honor to be able to be the arm candy of somebody like Dave Broom. So, and I got to shepherd him around the country a couple of different times between November and July of 2022 and 2023, promoting his new book, A Sense of Place. And, just to be in the room and, to listen to somebody who has that kind of comprehensive, not just knowledge, but a real second level understanding of the whole ecosystem of the industry. It's really wild to be able to share in that experience. And I'm glad you were able to as well.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the sense of place, I think encapsulates all of what you were saying, that macro understanding of the impacts of Scotch whiskey throughout. But also, I will say it was crazy being there because I listened to his book on tape before getting the physical copy, or not on tape, Audible, whatever modern technology is. And it's so great to hear him read it. Like, he actually reads his book. So it was crazy when I was there. I could just I was like, oh my God, it's just like listening to the book, but he's here. It was pretty awesome. So
I think the coolest part of that particular event, I mean, probably this may have been the coolest part of the whole tour. So we didn't have any visual aids at Tam O'Shanter. People are listening to this, right? So they don't see us. But Tam O'Shanter is this old school restaurant. It's been around for, I think, 101 years. And so they really weren't set up for any kind of, screens dropping down or anything like that. But, Dave, the consummate professional that he is, he's standing in this space for 50 guests or so. And then he just looks around at the different portraits that are up on the wall. Right. And I mean, like, through maybe 5 different portraits that have possibly been hanging there for 100 years, he basically gave us an oral history of Scotland. And, just the way he broke it down and how just serendipitously those 5 portraits kind of fit into the timeline of Scotland. And it was just really, really wild. And in that moment, I was just like, holy cow, we're in the presence of a really special dude, It was cool. It was a cool night. Great night. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Felt all like I was in cozy and up in the Highlands. But for sure. So pivoting, Dave is great. Maybe someday we'll be lucky enough to have him on. But for you though, let's take a little step back. Number one, so you are, I forgot your exact position, but you're with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. If you could share a little bit about your role there, but then also taking a step back and talking about your background, and then we can dive in more about what the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is and how it just reaches 40th birthday as well.
Absolutely. So for the last 7 years, I've been the senior director of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in the United States. I am really kind of taking care of all of the sales and operations for the society and a lot of the, I guess, what you would call member-facing activations. So in-person events, that kind of stuff. A little bit on the virtual side, mostly born out of COVID. But for the most part, getting together with members in person, shaking hands, sharing drams, that kind of thing. And then making sure, of course, the whiskey is flowing into the U.S. and we're getting it to our members. I choose the whiskeys that we bring into the U.S. and take care of all those logistics with my team. And we're responsible for about 7,000 members around the country. But the society started in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1983. And the United States is just one of about 30 countries that have a chapter of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Globally, we're up to about 40,000 members. So it's a nice little club. And it is a private members club, but it's exclusive, but it's not exclusionary. We welcome everyone. And it's really just about getting together, exploring the aromas and flavors of really interesting whiskey, and just continuing that taste journey and looking for discoveries every day. But stepping back from that, before the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, I was in various aspects of the wine and spirits industry. So I moved to New York City on January 2nd of 2001. On January 3rd, I took the 1 train down to the Upper West Side and walked into the first restaurant I saw, which looked kind of cool, across the street from the Museum of Natural History. And I said, hey, can I be a waiter? Have you been a waiter before? No, I haven't, but I'm a quick read. So they were like, yeah, sure, we'll take a chance on you. So I started with Ocean Grill, part of the Be Our Guest Corporation. I didn't know that at the time. I just thought of it as a cool looking seafood restaurant. But it turned out that it was, part of a pretty substantial group of restaurants around Manhattan at the time. And by the time I left to do straight retail, they had expanded into other markets. They had hotels and things like that. But thankfully, they were really interested in making sure that their staff were educated in wine specifically, and to a lesser extent spirits. So I studied under, at that time, the youngest master sommelier in the country, a guy named Greg Harrington, and a future master sommelier in Laura Manick. So they taught at first about 50 people, and then the advanced class was about 5 of us who carried through for a full year. And that's where I really got the foundation for wine education. And from there, I continued with Be Our Guest, but realized I didn't want to sling food any longer. I really just wanted to talk about wine, you know? So I transitioned into retail in 2004. So we're coming up on 20 years now in that, you know, in some form of either sales, marketing, or branding of wines and spirits. So I was in mostly wine. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brady.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so at that time, did you move into a distributor to work for a distributor, or were you working in like brick and mortar
off-premise retail?
Okay.
Yeah, brick and mortar retail. Yeah. And so there was a few shops I went to, but I think I really started a more of a serious career at Union Square Wines and the Union Square Wine Group. You know, there I was not only a wine salesperson, manager, I was also an events director. And when I took the job, they said, "Hey, by the way, in 2 weeks, we're firing the spirits director. So you're going to take his job." And I was like, "Oh, okay, great." So this huge liquor wall, you know, of not just Scotch, but all brown spirits, clear spirits, everything in between. And this is 2007. So you're also looking at the renaissance of the cocktail, you know, the Jerry Thomas turn of the century, all these different, you know, weird and wonderful elixirs that are being either recreated or reimagined that you could use for mixology. So it was a pretty exciting time to get into spirits. And for a few years there, it kind of ran in parallel, the wine, and I was going on wine trips and staying, you know, very focused on that. But spirits was a whole new chapter for me, and I got to learn a lot in a pretty small amount of time. And I think when you're in that kind of retail situation, you need to kind of be a jack of all and hopefully a master of a few. But, you know, you got to make sure you can talk about just about anything to a pretty good extent. So I did that for years, and then in 2014, started with Morell & Company, an old wine firm in Midtown Manhattan. And really for the next year and a half, almost 2 years, I was building investment portfolios, I think much like you guys at Vint do. So building investment portfolios for the 0.1 percenters, essentially, and making sure that people had amazing wine to drink, but also if they wanted to flip their bottles and put their kids through college on it, they could do that too, you know. So in that time at Morell & Company, it was a wonderful access to bottles you very rarely see. But I was also serving as a bit of a consultant on the spirit side, so kind of getting back into that. And then in April of 2016, I was approached by the society, and asked if I would take on this project, which is a pretty unique one. It's you know, essentially you're not brick and mortar. We are e-commerce, and we're also a private members club. So, you know, we're not on the shelves of any retail shops in the United States. In fact, the only place we're on retail shelves are in our own venues in the United Kingdom, in London, in Edinburgh, and Glasgow. So so as a member, you're essentially in front of your computer, surfing our website or calling our member services team and speaking with them, and then essentially the whiskey shows up to your door. So it's a you know, nice way to shop. You can shop in your PJs for sure, but you know, in the U.S. we don't have those members venues, but what we do have are bars that carry our whiskeys around the country. So we have right now probably about 12 bars that carry our whiskeys, 4 that are very active, one of them being Tam O'Shanter. And we look to expand on that, but it does take a lot of bandwidth and to, to keep all the whiskey moving and keep the members tuned in. That takes up a lot of our time. So, yeah. So you'll see I'm a bit long-winded. So,
Yeah.
bear with me and just cut me off, please, guys, whenever.
That's okay. I wanted to ask about when you were working with private clients and helping them source kind of portfolios and assets across wine and whiskey. Were there any common themes at that time about what folks were looking for, or sorts of what was, what were some of the highlights in terms of assets that you got to source for folks?
Well, Soldera. Do you guys remember? There was a Soldera tranche that came through. It was maybe, I think the vintage was 2007. And in 2009, there was like a huge, I think there was like a vandalization of the property, and a lot of the casks were dumped. So all of a sudden we have a bunch of 2007, and not knowing what the supply is going to be, that was something that we felt was an opportunity for our clients. That's one that sticks out. Burgundy was and obviously still is getting very, very expensive. So, even at the high end of investment, for some people, that's just a bridge too far for at least a lot of the Premier Cru, Grand Cru in the famous appellations. So I think Barolo was something that was really coming into its own, single vineyard. People realizing, collectors realizing that Barolo is at a more accessible price point. It has the same idea of Burgundy in that it's 100% monovarietal, and your different vineyard sites create different expressions of wine. So a lot of parallels without the absolute premium price tag there. So, and probably understanding that Barolo will get there at some point, but it's not quite there yet. So some great opportunities there, from some of the longer standing producers to more of the modern expressions. And then on the whiskey side, obviously Pappy, Pappy was the big thing, and it's still on the tips of everyone's tongues. And there's the big debate of old Stitzel-Weller versus new Stitzel-Weller and all this. But going back to 2007, I was going down to Frankfurt and buying entire barrels of Buff Trace, of Elmer T. Lee, of Eagle Rare, Weller, all these things at my leisure, and I was getting, five 12 bottle cases of Pappy 15 year.
Wow.
And, all the 10 year I wanted, that didn't even matter, 107 proof. Sure. What do you want? We'll give it to you. That kind of stuff was happening, not even 20 years ago. And now it's, it's all a fairy tale, and you got to have really deep pockets to access these things. So yeah, Pappy was a big thing. Also by 2014, 15, you saw the older ages of Suntory drying up. So 18 year was another example. In the early 2000s, you're selling it at $75 a pop, and as much as you want to sell it. And then all of a sudden they realize, holy cow, we're out of whiskey. We're out of our age statement. So, all of a sudden that 18 year becomes a very highly allocated, very expensive, seemingly overnight. So that those, the Japanese collections, not just Suntory, but Kurosawa, Chichibu, are all coming into focus. And then of course Nika. So Japanese was a great opportunity. But interestingly, independent bottlers I wasn't really seeing that there. That really wasn't for the wine collector. I think that's more for the whiskey enthusiast. So,
yeah, I wanted to lean into that now. So can you discuss a little bit about what kind of Scotch Malt Whisky Society is an independent bottler? Can you talk about the difference between that and, like, I don't know, just for everybody's edification, a distillery? But also, just even before we jump in, I will say that it's been interesting to see some of these independent bottlers, like Gordon and MacPhail as well, like as a different end. Like they are, and you guys with this new 40-year-old bottling too, moving into that luxury market where people are willing to pay these super premiums for some of these independent bottler price or bottlings as well. So
Yeah, and I'll say, we've been releasing this 40-year-old you're talking about, cask 12.79. This was our 40th anniversary release, and so this kind of is a separate thing. I guess internally we would consider it part of our vaults collection, which is our ultra prestige, top of the line, most precious spirits. But this cask that you're referring to is probably even somehow above that, just because of the fact that it is 40. It's the oldest that we've released in a really long time, and for this anniversary. But we've been releasing Vaults collection casks, which are typically anywhere from 25 to 33 years old, for a few years now, and we've seen great success in the United States with whiskey enthusiasts, with our members, purchasing those types of whiskeys. There's certainly a market for that, and I think globally you're seeing a premiumization of purchasing with Scotch, with other whiskeys, into other tequilas and that sort of thing as well. It's all kind of, everyone's trading up right now, so there is certainly a market for that. But to back up, an independent bottler is essentially someone who does not distill anything. A distillery creates their own spirit through the process of distillation, and they're aging in their warehouses, and then either, most typically, blending their own stocks together for a single malt, or they're maybe blending their own stocks with other whiskeys for a blended whiskey of some sort, or they're selling them to other companies that don't actually produce or distill any spirit, but they essentially guide a barrel of whiskey to bottling. And that's an independent bottler. Independent bottlers have been around since the mid 19th century. Cadenheads is the OG there. They've been doing it a really long time. Gordon and MacPhail as well. And in 1983, when the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was founded, those were really the only two independent bottlers around. And they were doing, a few single casks, but they were also doing, compositions as well, whether it was a single malt or blended malts, that sort of thing. But this Scotch Malt Whisky Society came along and realized that the beauty and intensity and just purity of single cask, unfiltered, undiluted, really the most natural, barring, basically taking out the splinters and the barrel sediment and leaving everything else there, all the essential oils and everything, and really maximizing the opportunity for flavor in the cask. And that discovery led to a few friends in Edinburgh kind of clubbing together and creating at first what was called a syndicate of whiskey lovers, and pooling their resources and sourcing some casks from Glenfarclas Distillery. That was the first, and subsequently several others. But yeah, and sharing that with each other, and as that first group of guys, after they drained that first cask of whiskey, teetered out into the night with their stash of single cask whiskey, they then shared it with their friends, and the friends start calling up our founder Pip and saying, "Hey, we want to get in on this," and then all the original guys were like, "Hey, we're out of whiskey, like let's do this again." So they tried and kept trying, and they hit a few roadblocks along the way, but figured out fairly ingenuitive ways to make this work. A lot of people said, "This isn't going to work. Like, the industry is not going to let you do this," and they said, "Well, that's boring. We can find a way to make this happen," and they did. 40 years later, group of guys sitting around Pip's kitchen have evolved into 40,000 members worldwide, which is pretty cool. So anyway, going back to independent bottling, you have these companies that buy a cask from a distillery, and they will either allow they'll typically ask the distillery to continue to store it in their warehouse, or most often they'll take that cask with them and age it in their own warehouse. And they can They can buy a cask of mature spirit that's ready to go. They can rather have a new filling done for them. So I'll approach, let's pick on Glenfarclas here. I'll approach the Grants and say, hey, I'd like 20 casks filled with your new make spirit, and I'll come and get them from you, or I'll come back in 10 years and collect them, that kind of thing. So now you have a spirit that's still aging in the cask. You can decide to bottle that, or you can decide to maybe transfer the contents into another cask, do a secondary maturation. A lot of people know that as finishing. And typically a finishing on a cask is a few months, maybe a few weeks, a few months at the most. At the Society, we like to call it additional maturation or secondary maturation, because minimum it's 2 years. Unless, of course, we're talking about gin, and that's a separate conversation altogether. But with whiskey, if we're taking the contents from, say, most typically an ex-bourbon barrel, putting it into whatever it might be, different kind of sherry cask, red wine cask, dessert wine cask, whatever it might be, or a designer of some sort. Typically, you're looking at 2 years minimum. The longest secondary maturation I've seen is 7 years. And that was on a recent Highland Park Distillery number 4 Vaults collection that we released. 31-year-old whiskey, 24 years in ex-bourbon, 7 years in a first fill Madeira hogshead. What a cool whiskey that is. It's remarkable.
So what's the difference? Why the disparity between, the typical, couple weeks or couple months of maturation and the sort of a hard line at no less than 2 years for y'all?
Well, I mean, it's not a hard line. It's not a hard line. It's just what has been happening. It's just what I've seen. In my interactions with the Society over the last 7 years, I don't think I've ever seen a whiskey that's seen a secondary maturation less than 2 years. That's all. I mean, it's not a hard line by any means, and it really comes down to. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is it just utilized as a way to add additional complexity earlier in the maturation of the whiskey, like to kind of speed up the addition of complexity?
It's a mixed bag. I think oftentimes, and this all comes down to the decisions by our head of whiskey creation, Ewan Campbell, who's based in Edinburgh. He manages all of these casks, and he decides, okay, so this whiskey is really good, but we can make it like effing awesome. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but we can make it really awesome by putting it another X amount of time in a hogshead, in a sherry, Oloroso, or say PX hogshead. And at that point, then he's continuously tasting and seeing when that optimization has been achieved. It's really like, it's always that balance of overcooking, your dish or whatever. You want to make sure that there is lots of flavor there, but you don't want the wood to take over. You want to make sure that there's a nice balance between the distillate and the cask. And so that's always a balancing act that I think he's gotten very, very good at over the years. And so, yeah, again, it's not a hard line. And listen, there might be something in the near future that's only aged a year, for whatever reason. And I would imagine that would probably be something that's aged remotely in say, Texas or something like that, or India, where the angel share, where the evaporation is so much more rapid, where you don't really want to age something over 6 years. So then that whole maturation process becomes truncated. So instead of 10 years in ex-bourbon and 4 years in a sherry cask, it's maybe 4 years in ex-bourbon and 1 year, that kind of thing.
Yeah, can you, I guess on that point too, maybe not to get too much into the weeds, but talk about like an active cask versus a non-active cask, and then how that also, is impacted by its environment? Because I think you just loosely touched on that as well. Yeah,
sure. So with casks, you have certain organoleptic characteristics you want to garner from that cask. And it's kind of different with American whiskey and also American oak versus Scotch whiskey and the use of European oak. And you're right, you can really get into the weeds here. But let me just use some broad strokes, boil it down real quick. So in Scotch, you have your new make spirit coming off the still. It enters into the cask, and then that whiskey, that spirit, because it's not whiskey yet, it's not whiskey until it's been aged 3 years, is interacting with the barrel, and through expansion, contraction of the pores in the cask, that spirit is entering and exiting the lining, the oak wall lining of the cask, and picking up certain flavor components. Also, the cask can serve to create a subtractive instead of an additive environment where it's taking out some of the harsher components of the spirit. So you're smoothing out the whiskey, you're adding color, you're also adding flavor. And then you have a few elements that you need to consider: the surface area of the spirit to the cask, or the whiskey to the cask. So the smaller the cask, the more surface area you have, probably the quicker your whiskey is going to mature and garner that color that you're looking for and that flavor that you're looking for. But also you have your environments. So in Scotland, the angel share, or the evaporation of alcohol, is typically around 1% to 2% a year. Now, again, these are broad strokes, because you step into any warehouse and all these guidelines go out the window. But about 1% to 2% a year in Scotland. In Kentucky, for instance, you're looking at about 5% to 8%. In Texas, Balcones, a distillery that we work with down in Waco, those guys are up around 12% to 15% per year. So, you're not going to see a Balcones single malt over 6 years old, because it's going to be cooked by then. It's going to be too much wood, and you're not going to have that balance. Now you go further afield, maybe to Taiwan or to Goa, India, and now you're in essentially an equatorial environment where you're upwards, it could be 18%, where you're really cooking, and that alcohol is really evaporating, and the wood is interacting quicker and quicker. And then, of course, you have the rocket scientists that go into distilling and figure out different ways to create a spirit that's aged 6 months, but somehow has at least some of the characteristics of a, for lack of a better term, properly aged spirit, or traditionally aged spirit. So you have all kinds, but yes, the cask is very, very important in Scotch. I mean, it's arguably more important in American whiskey because it's so highly regulated. There's a lot more room to play in Scotch, and I think for any of the American whiskey, bourbon lovers that are listening to your podcast, they'll find that maybe they're really into it right now, but the runway for flavor diversity is pretty short because of that. Always has to be for new American oak, char number 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there, and that limits the expression of the grain. And ironically, you can use more grain in American whiskey. You can use corn and rye and wheat and barley, but Scotch is 100% malted barley. It's only one grain. However, because of the cask, the flavor diversity is so much broader. That palette is so much wider. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And a lot of it comes down to the cask. Now, you can have probably the third part that I haven't talked about yet is the number of uses of that cask. So just about not all, but I'd say 90% of what's put into barrel is from first fill ex-bourbon. So going back to American whiskey law, for bourbon and rye, you can only use that barrel once. And once it's used, you can't use it again. So the American distilleries will either trade within their company. If it's a large drinks company that owns a bourbon distillery and a Scotch distillery, they'll just kind of trade in between in-house. Otherwise, you're selling them to distilleries. And the vast majority of Scotches are aged in first fill ex-bourbon. So that first filling is going to have the highest activity of spirit to barrel influence. Then you have second fill ex-bourbon, and then you have refill ex-bourbon. Now, there are other factors here. How long was that first fill spirit aged? Was it aged for 3 years? Was it aged for 20 years? And in what kind of environment was it? Was it a highly reactive environment? Or was it a bit more mellow and there wasn't so much influence, flavor impartment in there? And then you have first fill, second fill, and refill. So I think there might have been a time when you talked from a marketing standpoint now in third fill, fourth fill, but these days you don't do that. You see first fill, second fill, and refill. So refill could be a third usage up to sixth, seventh usage. That's really, whatever the independent bottler or the distiller, the manager decides is good. Do you really want your distillate to come through? You want that distillate off the still to really shine through, then you're going to use a less active barrel. You're going to use one of those refills. If you want a bit more, then maybe a second fill. If you want a lot of barrel character, then you're going to use that first fill. So that's probably a longer dive than we wanted to do, but that's quick, Wonder of Wood 101. And then we get into like sherry casks, Madeira casks, dessert wine casks, American oak versus European oak. There's a lot to talk about here, but it all results in flavor in the glass and aromatic and flavor diversity in the glass. And that's what's important.
How did you mention briefly sort of the short runway that enthusiasts of American whiskey and, bourbon, I guess, especially have in terms of their exploration? Was that kind of the path that you took as well? Of maybe you went
absolutely
kind of from wine to American bourbon and then eventually maybe rye and then Scotch.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's precisely right. With a little stop in mezcal along the way. I was like bonkers for mezcal when no one even knew what it was, but in any case, let's back up to wine, because when I got into wine, I was into Barossa Valley Shiraz and McLaren Vale Shiraz and, like big, juicy, Parkerized Cabernet. I don't know if I can say that. Sorry. I'm not sure, but in any case, souped up, palate slamming wine. And that's what I wanted at 24 years old. I wanted to get my ass kicked, with a big, like, mouthful of wine. And then, tastes change. Our tastes change and evolve several times over the course of our lives. And I went from, really seeking out these large format wines to now I'm a complete like Europhile. It's all about Burgundy and Barolo and old Riesling. And if I'm drinking California wine, it's either, Santa Cruz Pinot or really old like Mayacamas or Ridge, like Cabernet, that kind of thing. Like, give me a George de la Tour like from the early 80s, and I'm loving it. But a lot of the new release American wines these days are just too big for me, and that's that's all personal. That's all your kind of flavor journey. And the same thing happened. Excuse me, with whiskey. I was all in on American bourbon, and I was into the Wellers, into the big weeded bourbons. And don't get me wrong, I still am. But I recognize the kind of differences here now. George T. Stagg, like, the antique collection from Sazerac, like that was my jam. Like that I love that stuff. But you start to, again, like, maybe, what was it? Was it palate fatigue? Was it this opportunity? I'm sure that has something to do with it, of course, to manage these types of spirits. And all of a sudden you're going from kind of knowing a little bit about a lot of different things to really drilling down into one specific part of the entire collection of spirits. So yeah, it's just a realization that there are so many more flavors out there beyond, you know, the burnt caramel and the orange peel and the maraschino cherry, you know, that you get from these whiskeys. Now rye is beautiful and amazing, and that's another one that I really enjoy. And you're right, it kind of went from bourbon to rye. Then I started getting into like Armagnac and that kind of thing. Aged rums came along, and I'm into mezcal, and you know, but Scotch was always there. Like Scotch was always there from from the first sip of a Dewar's and soda I got at age 7 to like my dad bringing a Glenlivet 25 year to my college graduation. And, you know, Scotch was always there, especially in my family, being, you know, European mutts from England, Scotland, Ireland. It was always there. So it is really fun to kind of take a step back, and hindsight is always 2020, you know, but when you're in the middle of it, it's maybe a little tougher to recognize, but it's fun to see that evolution of your tastes and what, you know, what you're into these days, you know. And right now, I don't know if you guys have had the chance to taste much vintage bourbon, but pre-prohibition bourbon, man, it's a brave new world. Let me tell you, like it's really amazing stuff if you can get your hands on it. It's really interesting to taste stuff from the 1900s, from like 1910s, 1920s, and see how, and Scotch too, of course. You know, you can find a 1930s White Horse. Ooh, that is a treat. Anyway, I digress. I'm getting off.
Yeah, I think
getting off topic, Billy.
When Billy and I were in Covington, Kentucky, went to the Revival bottle shop down there, and had, what was it, 80? Was it 86 or 83 Old Taylor? And that's still the best whiskey.
That like a 70s maker.
That's right. And they're still the best
whiskey
I've had.
So a shout out to Brad Bonds. And yes, I was at Revival a few weeks ago, because I was actually doing some gathering some intel for a potential distillery to work with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Not too far from there. I'll leave it at that. But yes, that's where I've gotten to taste crazy things like that. So yeah, if you're bourbon lovers and you just want an experience like none other, get to Revival in Covington, Kentucky. It's special stuff. And, you know, it makes you realize, okay, well, the whiskeys being produced today are good, but man, those ones back then, those are freaking special. Like those are wild. Yeah. Who knows? Maybe they'll be saying the same thing about, you know, the current releases now in 50 years. So we'll see.
True. I was going to ask, on the topic of tastes, are you seeing, I guess I'm on the Scotch side of things now. Like I know a lot of like peated expressions, like Islay was very, very popular for a while. Are you still seeing that same kind of trend, or are people looking, I know like sherry Speyside stuff became really popular as well. What are you seeing in the macro Scotch kind of trends right now?
Well, you know, I can speak within the context of our members, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And I'll, you know, going back to the flavor journey we're talking about here, I'm seeing a similar phenomenon happening with new members to, you know, members who have been around a couple of years to really well tenured members, and the ones who are just joining typically have been into Scotch in some way, shape, or form, peripherally or a bit more involved, but are now getting into the single cask strength expression. And oftentimes they may, you know, if they're into a certain kind of expression, they'll just kind of stick to that expression within our inventory. But sherry is huge. Peat is huge. Peat and sherry in the same glass. I mean, then you're in heaven. You know, it's all your bells and whistles are right there for you. And, you know, you talk to a lot of Islay drinkers, they're going to tell you typically one of two, at least burgeoning Islay drinkers, one of their two favorite distilleries are either Lagavulin, which has all the peat and the sherry together, or Lefroy, which is just completely wacky, like hospital juice. But peat is still huge. It's really, really popular. Islay Festival is like, you're up to like 20,000 people on that island for that festival every May. It's insane. But now in parallel, sherried whiskeys, mostly in the space side, driven by the Macallan, the Dalmore, those kinds of things, those kinds of distilleries. Those are also very, very popular. So you have kind of the rock concert of sherry and peat, big, big flavors in your mouth. But then the more tenured members of the society, they still enjoy those. They still really like them, but they're seeking out more of the refill ex bourbon, the 18-year-old Speyside. That's a bit more of like a jazz club as opposed to that rock concert. It's a bit more nuanced. You might have to sit with the whiskey a little bit longer and really kind of maybe not concentrate. I mean, you don't want to make it work, but you realize how much the whiskey can change over an extended amount of time. And I think as members are with us longer and longer, they probably start out in that big flavor spectrum and kind of shift to the more nuanced, highly active barrel to fairly inactive cask along the way. But that's what's great about the society is, right now we probably have about 50 different casks on our website and all kinds of different flavor profiles, and people can really, they can drink the familiar, or they can drink outside the box and get really wacky and wild with it. It's up to them, and yeah. So certainly seeing that, and from a business standpoint, the society is certainly ramping up sherry cask maturation. We have invested a good amount of money in relationships with bodegas in Jerez. And I think Ewan is down there probably once a month, if not once every few months, just to be choosing casks and make sure that we have a steady supply. And our sherried stock will continue to increase because that's what members want. That's what the majority of members are looking for, is more sherry. And the peat, you get the peat you can get. When I started in 2016, it was, a Lefroy was being released every single month. Bowmore was being released every single month, but there was no Caol to be found. And today, Caol every single month, no Bowmore, no Lefroy. I mean, that's just the kind of the ebb and the flow, the hills and valleys of the trade, and what's available to you. But people are always looking for the peat, for sure. Yeah. I believe they call them they call themselves tar lifers. So, they're always looking for that grubby, smoky, tarry stuff. I can't blame them. It's good stuff.
That's funny. Yeah, Tom, I was just looking more through some of the bottlings, and I see you got them for those folks who are watching on YouTube. You got a good many bottles back behind you. I think that's really neat. Just sort of the exclusivity of those one-off offerings is really cool, and kind of to be able to put together a collection of things that you simply can't walk into a store really anywhere and pick off the shelf, except for, I guess, your partners. But for most of us, it's a really neat club. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing.
Yeah, for sure. It's the curse and the blessing of the single cask. You have about 200 bottles out of every cask, and that's split up amongst different countries, or sometimes all for us. But when it's gone, it's gone. So you don't want to hesitate. You just want to snatch that stuff up. But well, thank you very much, guys, for having me. And
we'll put information about the society in the we'll put information about the society in the footer in the description of the episode. Didn't know if there was anything that you wanted to share, kind of anything upcoming or sort of special news that you wanted to share for folks, or if kind of linking out to the site and to membership would be the best thing.
Yeah, certainly go to smwsa.com to check out our newly revamped website. You'll find the join page there. Give us a call. We're very, very happy to chat with you. And then, of course, I met Billy at a Dave Broom event, but we do monthly outturn preview tastings where we do 6 selections from our upcoming monthly release. We do those in 8 to 10 cities around the country. So you can go on Eventbrite and look for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society there. And hopefully I will be back in Los Angeles for a Burns Supper celebration. So I will be baring my knees for all to see and sporting the kilt. And hopefully you guys can join us and we can eat some haggis and do some fun toasts together.
I would love that. Well, I'll look forward to that. But in the meantime, thanks again for coming on. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks. All right, that was our interview with Tom Smith. I hope everybody enjoyed and actually comes out of it knowing a little bit more about why your whiskey tastes the way it does. And also, hopefully you guys will go out and check out the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, maybe become a member. It's pretty interesting and pretty, hard to find an opportunity to find single cask whiskeys that are made in such small volumes outside of an organization like this. So pretty great. I highly recommend it. And we'll be back, like Brady said, with an episode actually on Wednesday next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.